Welcome to the vast and fascinating world of incredible stories by Niall Davis. We hope you enjoy this one as much as everyone else has. Written by Niall Davis and produced by Defcon Eagle. We are thrilled to share with you tonight the podcast that knew too much. A true crime podcast uncovers secrets that someone will kill to keep hidden. Enjoy and don't miss out on future adventures. Chapter 1. The Voice on the Tape. Eli Harper adjusted his headphones and pressed the record button on his microphone. The small, cluttered room around him was dimly lit by a single desk lamp, its light casting long shadows across stacks of newspapers, court transcripts, and crime scene photos. On the wall behind him hung a corkboard filled with pins and strings connecting a chaotic collage of faces, places, and timelines. The room had the unmistakable energy of obsession, and Eli was its reluctant curator. Welcome back to Behind the Static, the podcast where we pull back the curtain on the mysteries hiding in plain sight. I'm your host, Eli Harper, and today, we're diving into a case that's haunted this town for decades, the Whispering Pines disappearances. Eli paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in before continuing. He'd honed this skill over the past 3 years, perfecting the art of storytelling that kept his listeners hooked. But this one was personal. Between 1993 and 1996, 5 women vanished without a trace near a small diner just off Highway 47. No bodies were ever found, and no suspects were ever charged. Officially, the case went cold. But unofficially, the whispers never stopped. Eli's fingers grazed the edge of a faded photograph on his desk. It showed the Whispering Pines Diner, a squat, weathered building with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. It was the kind of place that felt like it had existed forever, suspended in time. The photo had been taken in 1994, just a year before the last disappearance. In the background, barely noticeable, was a group of people seated at a table. Eli's heart skipped a beat every time he looked at it. There he was, a small boy of 8, sitting next to his father. Why did the trail go cold? Eli continued, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his chest. Why did the local authorities fail to connect the dots? And why? Why do I keep finding pieces of myself in this story? He stopped the recording and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The connection felt impossible, yet undeniable. His father had worked at the Whispering Pines Diner for years as a cook, a fact Eli had only recently uncovered while sifting through old family photos. The realization had hit him like a freight train, sending him spiraling into a rabbit hole he wasn't sure he wanted to explore. The phone on his desk buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. The screen displayed an unknown number. Eli hesitated before answering, his voice cautious. Hello? There was silence on the other end, followed by a faint, almost imperceptible breath. Then, a voice, gravelly and low, as if the speaker was deliberately masking their identity. You're looking in the wrong place, kid. Eli's stomach dropped. Who is this? He demanded, his voice shaking slightly. But the line had already gone dead. He stared at the phone, his mind racing. The logical part of him wanted to dismiss the call as a prank, the work of a bored listener trying to spook him. But deep down, he knew better. The timing was too perfect, the words too precise. Eli glanced back at the corkboard, at the tangle of clues he'd spent months piecing together. For the first time, it all seemed wrong, like a puzzle assembled with pieces that didn't quite fit. The wrong place, he muttered to himself. As the words lingered in the air, a chill ran down his spine. Whatever he thought he knew about this case was about to be turned upside down. And he had the sinking feeling that the answers he sought might come at a price he wasn't ready to pay. Chapter 2. The Diner. Eli Harper parked his car on the gravel shoulder of Highway 47, just across from the Whispering Pines Diner. The diner stood like a relic from a bygone era, its once bright neon sign now flickering intermittently in the late afternoon gloom. The word, whispering, was missing an S, leaving the sign to read, Whispering Pines. A cracked window near the entrance reflected the overcast sky, giving the whole place an eerie, abandoned feel. As he stepped out of his car, Eli could feel the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. A cool wind swept through the air, carrying the faint scent of rain. He slung his messenger bag over his shoulder, the weight of his recorder and notebook pressing against his side. His heart thudded in his chest as he approached the entrance. The diner's door creaked loudly when he pushed it open, announcing his arrival to the empty room. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and grease, as if the scent had seeped into the walls over decades. The place looked frozen in time. Red vinyl booths with torn upholstery, a long counter with swivel stools, and a jukebox in the corner that seemed more decorative than functional. Behind the counter stood a lone figure, a woman in her 60s with a hardened expression and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She wore a faded uniform and wiped her hands on a dish towel as she sized Eli up. "We're closed," she said flatly, though she didn't seem to be in any hurry to show him the door. "I'm not here to eat," Eli replied, pulling his recorder out of his bag. "I'm working on a story. About the disappearances." The woman's eyes narrowed. "You're one of those podcasters, aren't you?" "Guilty," Eli admitted with a small smile, though it quickly faded under her scrutinizing gaze. "You people are like vultures," she muttered, setting the towel down. "Picking at bones that ought to be left buried." "I'm not here to stir up trouble," Eli said, his tone earnest. "I just want to understand what happened. Maybe even find answers for the families." The woman's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained wary. "Families stopped looking for answers a long time ago," she said. "All you're gonna do is open old wounds." Eli didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced around the room, taking in every detail. His gaze settled on a faded black and white photograph hanging on the wall behind the counter. It showed a group of employees standing in front of the diner, smiling for the camera. His stomach tightened when he recognized one of the faces, his father, younger and leaner, wearing a cook's apron. "That photo," Eli said, pointing. "Do you remember him? The cook?" The woman turned to look, her eyes lingering on the photo for a moment before returning to Eli. "You knew Danny?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "He was my father," Eli said, the words feeling heavy as they left his mouth. The woman's expression shifted to one of guarded curiosity. "Danny Harper," she said softly. "Didn't think anyone from his family was still around." "I need to know what he was like back then," Eli said. "What he might have known about the disappearances." The woman sighed and leaned against the counter. "Danny was quiet, kept to himself mostly. But he had a temper, too. You didn't want to get on his bad side." She hesitated, as if debating whether to continue. "Look, I don't know what you're hoping to find, but digging into Danny's past ain't gonna bring you peace. Trust me on that." Eli's recorder beeped as he stopped the recording. He slipped it back into his bag, his mind racing. His father's connection to the diner felt like a loose thread, and he couldn't resist the urge to pull it. "Thank you," he said finally. "If you remember anything else, anything at all, here's my card." He slid a business card across the counter before turning to leave. "Kid," the woman called after him. Eli stopped and looked back. "Be careful," she said. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Sometimes the answers you're looking for, they're not the ones you want to find." Eli nodded, the weight of her warning settling on his shoulders as he stepped back out into the wind. The diner's door creaked shut behind him, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the unsettling feeling that the case was about to take a darker turn. Chapter 3. Hidden Threads. The hum of Eli Harper's car engine filled the silence as he drove back to his apartment. The conversation with the woman at the diner replayed in his mind, her cryptic warning echoing louder than he wanted it to. "Sometimes the answers you're looking for, they're not the ones you want to find." He gripped the steering wheel tighter. She hadn't given him much to go on, but what she'd said about his father's temper lingered. It was a side of Danny Harper Eli had never seen, or perhaps one he'd been too young to recognize. His father had always been a quiet man, working long hours and coming home late, his apron smelling faintly of grease. But could there have been something darker beneath that unassuming exterior? Eli parked in front of his building, killed the engine, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment. The sky was darkening, and the streetlights flickered on, casting an orange glow over the empty street. He grabbed his bag, his recorder, and the photo of the diner he'd taken from the wall. It felt like stealing, but he'd justify it later if it led to answers. Once inside his apartment, Eli tossed his keys on the counter and spread the photo out on his desk. His father's face stared back at him from the black and white image, younger and sharper, but unmistakably him. Eli's hands hovered over his keyboard as he prepared to type his notes, but a gnawing feeling stopped him. He needed more context, more connections. He opened the boxes he dragged out of his mother's attic months ago. They were filled with old family photos, receipts, and faded letters. He dug through them carefully, the dust tickling his nose. Finally, he found something, an old leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked, and the pages yellowed with age. The handwriting inside was his father's, neat and precise, a stark contrast to the man Eli remembered. Most of the entries were mundane, cataloging work shifts and bills, but one entry, dated May 12, 1995, stood out. She asked too many questions. They all do. Can't let this get out. Can't let her get out. Eli's breath caught in his throat. He read the words again, his heart pounding. Who was she? And what had his father meant by, can't let her get out? He flipped through the journal feverishly, but there were no other entries like it. The rest were unremarkable, the routine thoughts of a man trying to keep his life together. The single cryptic note felt like a needle in a haystack, and yet it was enough to send Eli's mind spinning. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Logan, his producer and best friend. "Hey, man," Logan said when Eli answered. "How'd it go at the diner?" Eli hesitated, glancing at the journal on his desk. "Weird. The woman who runs the place, she knew my dad. Said he had a temper." "A temper? That doesn't sound like the guy you've described." "Yeah, well, maybe I didn't know him as well as I thought." Eli's voice was tight. "I found one of his old journals, Logan. There's this entry from 1995. It's disturbing." "What does it say?" Eli read the passage aloud, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Logan said, "That's intense. You think he was talking about one of the victims?" "I don't know, but it's not good. If my dad knew something about those disappearances and didn't say anything." Eli trailed off, the thought too heavy to finish. "You need more context," Logan said firmly. "Maybe he's innocent, but if he's not, you've got to find out." "I know," Eli said. "I'll keep digging." After they hung up, Eli stared at the photo and the journal, his mind racing. His father's past wasn't just a thread in this story, it was the whole damn fabric. And unraveling it might mean tearing apart everything Eli thought he knew about his family. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the investigation settling heavily on his shoulders. Somewhere in the maze of clues, someone knew the truth. And Eli was determined to find them, no matter what it cost. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Past. Eli's determination solidified overnight. The journal entry had cracked open a door he wasn't sure he wanted to walk through, but the pull of the unknown was irresistible. By morning, he had a plan. He would start by revisiting the diner and digging into its history, then track down anyone who had worked there during the 1990s. The diner sat quietly under the morning sun, its parking lot nearly empty. Eli stepped inside, the smell of frying bacon and coffee greeting him. It felt surreal being here again, knowing what he now knew, or thought he knew, about his father. The woman from the day before, whose name he'd learned was Doris, wasn't at the counter. Instead, a younger waitress, perhaps in her early 20s, was bustling about, refilling coffee cups and taking orders. Eli approached her, flashing a friendly smile. "Hey, is Doris around today?" The waitress shook her head, barely looking up as she jotted down an order. "She's off Wednesdays. Anything I can help you with?" "Actually, yeah," Eli said. "I'm doing some research for a podcast, and I'm looking into the history of this diner. Do you know if there's anyone else I could talk to? Maybe someone who's worked here a long time?" The waitress paused, her brow furrowing. You might try Charlie. He's been coming here forever and used to own the place back in the day." She nodded toward an older man sitting in a booth near the window, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper. Eli thanked her and made his way over. The man looked up as he approached, his eyes sharp despite his age. "Mind if I join you?" Eli asked. Charlie shrugged. "Free country." Eli slid into the booth, pulling out his recorder. "My name's Eli Harper. I'm working on a podcast about some of the disappearances in this area back in the 90s. I heard you used to own this place?" Charlie's expression didn't change, but his grip on his coffee cup tightened slightly. "Yeah, I ran the diner for about 30 years. Sold it in 2005. Do you remember anything about the disappearances? The women who went missing?" Eli asked, keeping his tone casual. Charlie's eyes narrowed. "Lot of rumors back then. People said all kinds of things. The cops never found much, though." Eli decided to take a risk. "My dad worked here during that time." "Danny Harper. Ring any bells?" For the first time, Charlie's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition, quickly masked. "Danny? Huh? Quiet guy, kept to himself. Good worker, though." Did you ever notice anything unusual about him? Eli pressed. Charlie's lips tightened into a thin line. Look, kid, a lot of people came and went through this place. Your dad was just one of them. If you're looking for ghosts, you'll find them anywhere if you dig hard enough. Eli leaned back, sensing he'd hit a wall. But he wasn't ready to give up. Do you know anyone else I could talk to? Former employees? Regulars from back then? Charlie sighed, rubbing his temples. There was a guy named Frank. He worked the grill for a while. Don't know where he is now, but he used to hang around the old bowling alley uptown. You might try there. Eli thanked him and left, his mind racing. The bowling alley wasn't far, and if this Frank had any insight, it could be a breakthrough. The bowling alley was a relic of the past, its neon sign flickering and several letters burned out. Inside, the sound of crashing pins mixed with faint rock music and the murmur of conversations. Eli approached the counter and asked the young man working there if Frank was around. Yeah, he's in lane 6, the guy said, nodding toward the far end of the alley. Eli made his way over, spotting a wiry man with graying hair and a cigarette tucked behind his ear. Frank glanced up as Eli approached, his eyes wary. You Frank? Eli asked. Depends. Who's asking? Eli Harper. I'm doing a podcast about some of the disappearances around here in the 90s. I heard you used to work at the diner back then. Frank's jaw tightened. That was a long time ago. I'm trying to piece together what happened, Eli said. Anything you remember could help. Frank hesitated, then gestured for Eli to sit. I'll tell you this much. There was something off about that place. And about your dad. Eli's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Frank leaned in, lowering his voice. He wasn't a bad guy, but he had secrets. Everyone does, I guess. But his? They were the kind that kept you up at night. Like what? Eli asked. Frank shook his head. You'll have to figure that out yourself, kid. Just be careful. Some things are better left buried. As Eli left the bowling alley, his chest felt tight. The echoes of the past were growing louder, and with each step, he felt himself getting closer to something he might not want to find. Chapter 5. Shadows Take Shape. Eli's head buzzed with questions as he sat in his car outside the bowling alley. The cryptic words from Frank lingered like smoke, impossible to brush away. His father had secrets, secrets that kept people up at night. What did that mean? Eli clenched the steering wheel, debating his next move. He couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. The next stop was the town library. It wasn't the most glamorous location for an investigation, but Eli had learned over the years that libraries were treasure troves for anyone willing to dig. The building was small and quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights filling the space as he stepped inside. A librarian with glasses perched on her nose looked up from the desk. Hi, Eli said, offering a polite smile. I'm looking for old newspapers, specifically from the 90s. Do you have archives here? The librarian nodded. We do. Microfilm in the back corner. I can show you how to use the machine if you need. That would be great, thanks, Eli replied. An hour later, Eli was flipping through articles, his eyes scanning every headline for something related to the disappearances. It wasn't long before he struck gold. A front-page story from 1996 caught his attention. Local woman disappears after leaving diner. The article detailed the last known sighting of a woman named Marcy Bennett, who had been seen leaving the diner late one evening. Witnesses described her as smiling, chatting with a man in a work uniform. Eli's stomach tightened. He read further. Authorities have not identified the man Marcy was seen speaking to, but sources confirm he worked at the diner at the time. Law enforcement officials declined to release additional information, citing an ongoing investigation. Eli leaned back, staring at the screen. A work uniform. His father had worn one just like it during his years at the diner. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His phone buzzed on the table, jolting him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. His heart skipped. Eli hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello? There was a pause. Then a familiar voice, low and raspy, came through. Kid, you're digging in the wrong place. Eli's blood ran cold. It was the same voice that had called him before. Who is this? He demanded. The voice chuckled darkly. If you're smart, you'll stop. Some questions aren't meant to be answered. The line went dead. Eli sat frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. Who was this person? And how did they know he was investigating? Shaking off the fear, Eli decided to keep going. He'd come too far to stop now. Leaving the library, he returned to his motel room, where he spread out his notes on the small desk. He reviewed everything he'd gathered so far, the journal entry, Charlie's guarded words, Frank's warning, and now the newspaper article. Threads of a pattern began to emerge, though they were still tangled and incomplete. His thoughts returned to the women who had disappeared. There had to be a common thread, something that linked them to the diner and, potentially, to his father. Pulling out his laptop, Eli searched for more information on Marcy Bennett. He found an old forum post written by her sister, pleading for any information about her disappearance. The post mentioned that Marcy had recently started a new job before she went missing. Eli's fingers hovered over the keyboard. What if the other women also shared a connection to their workplaces? If he could identify a pattern in their jobs or routines, it might lead him closer to the truth. He made a list of names from the few articles he'd found so far and began cross-referencing them with employment records, social media profiles, anything he could dig up online. Hours passed, and Eli's eyelids grew heavy. Just as he was about to call it a night, a detail jumped out at him. 2 of the missing women had briefly worked at the same gas station, one that was less than a mile from the diner. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just a coincidence. Eli leaned back, staring at the names and connections scribbled across his notepad. The shadows of the past were beginning to take shape, but they were far from clear. One thing was certain. Someone out there knew exactly what he was uncovering, and they wanted him to stop. Chapter 6. Unveiling Connections. The morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Eli's motel room, casting soft golden streaks across his scattered notes. He sat hunched over the desk, the events of the previous day replaying in his mind. The connections were forming, but they were tenuous at best, like a fragile spiderweb stretched taut. The gas station connection was his most promising lead yet. He decided to follow it, hoping to find a thread that could lead him closer to the truth. After a quick breakfast at a nearby diner, Eli drove to the gas station, a small and unassuming building with faded signage and a cracked asphalt lot. A lone attendant stood behind the counter, a young man in his 20s with a bored expression and earbuds nestled in his ears. Eli approached with his usual mix of determination and caution. "Hey," Eli said, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Do you have a manager or someone who's been working here for a while? I'm looking into some old records." The attendant blinked at him, pulling out one earbud. Yeah. Lisa's been here forever. She's in the office in the back. You need me to grab her? If you don't mind," Eli replied with a polite smile. A few minutes later, Lisa emerged from the back office, wiping her hands on her jeans. She was a woman in her late 40s, with sharp eyes and an air of efficiency. "You're looking for records?" she asked, crossing her arms. Eli nodded. "I'm a journalist working on a story about local disappearances from the 90s. I noticed that a couple of the women who went missing worked here briefly. I was wondering if you remembered anything unusual about them or the time they spent here." Lisa's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing slightly. The 90s was a long time ago. But yeah, I remember the disappearances. It was the talk of the town for a while. As for the girls who worked here, I don't know. They were just kids, you know. Nice enough. Didn't stay long. Do you remember anything about their routines? Did they ever mention the diner up the road? Eli pressed. Lisa's lips pursed as she thought. They used to go there sometimes after shifts. It's where everyone went back then. Cheap food, open late. Why? Eli hesitated, deciding how much to reveal. I'm trying to piece together their last movements before they disappeared. Anything you remember, no matter how small, could help. Lisa tilted her head, studying him. Finally, she sighed. I remember one thing. There was this guy who used to hang around the station a lot back then. Creepy sort. I don't remember his name, but he always wore a baseball cap and drove this old, beat-up truck. Used to park over by the diner too, now that I think about it. Always watching people. Gave me the chills. Eli's pulse quickened. Do you think you could describe him? Or the truck? It was ages ago, Lisa said with a shrug. The truck was red, I think. Rusty. And the guy, average build, maybe in his 40s back then. Dark hair, kind of wiry. That's all I've got. Thank you, Eli said, jotting down notes. This is more helpful than you know. Back in his car, Eli stared at his notepad. The description of the man and the truck burned into his mind. A chill ran through him as he thought about the implications. Could this man be connected to his father? The diner? The disappearances? He decided to dig further into the diner itself. He needed to know more about who worked there, especially during the years when the women disappeared. Driving to the county records office, he requested employment records for the diner. The clerk was hesitant at first but eventually provided the information Eli needed. The list of names included a few that rang familiar, but one stood out: James Crawford. Eli's father. Sitting in his motel room later that evening, Eli stared at the name on the paper, his hands trembling. His father's name was right there, intertwined with the timelines of the disappearances. The shadow of doubt he'd been suppressing was now impossible to ignore. He felt a surge of anger, confusion, and fear. Eli reached for his recorder. He needed to process this aloud, to make sense of the swirling chaos in his mind. Pressing the record button, he began to speak. Today, I learned that my father's name appears in the employment records of the diner during the time of the disappearances. I don't know what to think. I don't want to believe he could have been involved, but the evidence is stacking up. There's also this mystery man with the red truck. Who is he? And why does he feel so central to all of this? He paused, running a hand through his hair. Someone's trying to stop me from finding the truth. They called me again today, telling me I'm digging in the wrong place. But I don't think I am. I think I'm getting closer. And that scares the hell out of me. Eli turned off the recorder and sat in silence, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. The shadows were no longer just lingering at the edges. They were taking shape, looming large, and they felt personal. Chapter 7. Crossroads of Truth. The evening air was thick with tension as Eli sat in his car, parked a block away from the diner. The faint glow of the neon sign buzzed in the distance, casting a flickering light over the cracked pavement. His discovery about his father weighed on him like an anchor. The diner, once a nostalgic marker of his childhood, now stood as a looming monument to unanswered questions. Eli's thoughts were interrupted by a buzz from his phone. It was a text from Rachel. Rachel? Any updates? Let me know if you're okay. Eli hesitated before replying. Eli, I'm fine. I found something big. I'll call you later. Sliding his phone back into his pocket, Eli took a deep breath. The diner felt like the next piece of the puzzle, but walking in there felt like stepping into the jaws of a trap. Still, he couldn't ignore the pull of the place. The bell above the door jingled as Eli stepped inside. The diner hadn't changed much since his childhood. Red vinyl booths, a linoleum floor scuffed by decades of foot traffic, and the faint aroma of grease hanging in the air. A handful of patrons sat scattered around, nursing coffee or meals. Behind the counter, an older waitress with graying hair and a name tag that read Marge greeted him with a tired smile. Sit anywhere, hun, she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Eli chose a booth near the back, giving him a clear view of the room. He pulled out his notebook, pretending to jot down casual observations. His real focus, however, was on the faces of the patrons and staff, searching for anything, anyone, that might connect to his investigation. Marge approached with a coffee pot. You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders, she said, pouring him a cup. Eli managed a faint smile. Just passing through. This place brings back memories. Marge raised an eyebrow. That so? You from around here? Used to be, Eli said. My dad worked here back in the 90s. James Crawford. You wouldn't happen to remember him, would you? Marge's expression tightened for a moment, almost imperceptibly, before she shrugged. Can't say I do. Lot of folks have come and gone over the years. What did he do here? Kitchen, Eli said, watching her carefully. Short order cook, quiet guy. Marge's gaze drifted to the counter as she poured more coffee for another table. Sorry, hun. Like I said, it's been a long time. But Eli didn't miss the way her hand trembled slightly as she set the pot down. As the evening wore on, Eli stayed in the diner, nursing his coffee and observing. The patrons rotated in and out, but one figure caught his attention, a man sitting alone at the counter, wearing a faded baseball cap. He'd been there when Eli arrived, and though he seemed engrossed in his meal, his eyes darted toward Eli more than once. Eli's gut told him this wasn't a coincidence. Gathering his courage, he approached the counter and slid onto a stool a few seats away from the man. Good food here, huh? Eli said casually. The man glanced at him, his expression guarded. Yeah, been coming here for years. Eli nodded, playing it cool. Same here. My dad used to work here, back in the day. James Crawford. You ever hear of him? The man's grip on his coffee cup tightened ever so slightly. Can't say I have. Why you asking? Just curious, Eli said. I'm working on a story about the old diner. Nostalgia piece. Thought I'd see if anyone remembered him. The man's eyes narrowed. Well, Some memories are best left buried. Before Eli could respond, the man stood, tossed a few bills on the counter, and walked out, leaving the door swinging behind him. Eli's heart raced as he watched the man disappear into the night. He debated following him but decided against it. He needed to play the long game. Instead, he returned to his booth and flipped open his notebook, jotting down every detail he could remember about the man. The faded baseball cap, the deep lines on his face, the way he'd reacted to the mention of Eli's father. As he wrote, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from an unknown number. Eli's pulse quickened as he hesitated, then answered. "Hello? You're getting too close," the voice on the other end said, low and menacing. "Stay out of it, or you'll regret it." The line went dead. Eli stared at his phone, his hands trembling. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare him. They were serious. But instead of fear, Eli felt a surge of determination. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. The truth was out there, and he was closer than ever. Chapter 8. Shadow Games. Eli's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he pulled away from the diner. The cryptic call still echoed in his mind. "You're getting too close." The voice was unrecognizable, but the message was clear. Someone was watching him. His resolve to uncover the truth hardened, but so did the tension in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that the noose around him was tightening. He drove aimlessly for a while, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and determination. When his phone buzzed with a notification, he nearly jumped. It was a text from Rachel. "Rachel, Eli, call me ASAP. I found something." Without hesitation, Eli pulled into an empty parking lot and dialed her number. She picked up after the first ring. "Eli, I've been digging through the archives you sent me," Rachel said, her voice tinged with urgency. "I think I found a connection." "What is it?" Eli asked, leaning forward as if the answer would come faster that way. "It's about the women who disappeared," Rachel explained. "Most of them were reported missing within a 10-mile radius of the diner, right?" "Well, I cross-referenced their names with employment records from the 1990s. 3 of them worked there." Eli's stomach churned. "They worked at the diner?" "Yes," Rachel confirmed. "And there's more. One of the women filed a police report a month before she vanished. She accused someone at the diner of harassment." "Who?" Eli demanded. Rachel hesitated. "The report doesn't name names, but it mentions a cook." "Eli, it could have been your dad." The words hit Eli like a sledgehammer. His father's face flashed in his mind, kind, reserved, and always distant. Could the man who taught him to tie his shoes and ride a bike be hiding such a dark secret? The next morning, Eli sat at his desk, staring at the corkboard where he'd pinned photos, notes, and timelines. The connections Rachel had found added more fuel to his theory, but they also deepened the mystery. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start: the man from the diner. Eli spent hours searching online, using every detail he'd observed about the man to track him down. A faded baseball cap, weathered features, and an air of unease weren't much to go on, but eventually, he found a name: Carl Hendricks. A former dishwasher at the diner, Hendricks had a brief stint in prison for assault in the late 1990s. Now, he lived in a rundown trailer park on the outskirts of town. The trailer park was as bleak as Eli had imagined. Rusted vehicles sat in overgrown yards, and the air smelled faintly of garbage and mildew. He parked his car a few spaces away from Carl's trailer and took a deep breath. His heart pounded as he approached the door, the creaking of the wooden steps beneath his feet amplifying the silence around him. He knocked twice. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. "Who is it?" A gruff voice called from inside. "I'm Eli Crawford," he said. "I'm a journalist. I need to ask you some questions about the diner." For a moment, there was silence. Then the door opened just a crack, revealing Carl's wary eyes. "I don't talk to reporters," Carl said, starting to close the door. Eli wedged his foot in the gap. "This isn't just a story for me," he said, his voice firm. "My father worked there. I need to know the truth." Carl's gaze softened slightly, but suspicion lingered. After a moment's hesitation, he opened the door wider and gestured for Eli to come in. The inside of the trailer was cluttered and smelled of stale beer. Carl motioned for Eli to sit on a worn-out couch while he settled into a recliner across the room. A long silence stretched between them before Carl finally spoke. "You're James's kid, huh?" he said, lighting a cigarette. "Didn't think I'd ever see one of you Crawfords again." Eli leaned forward. "You knew my dad?" Carl nodded. Yeah, I knew him. Quiet guy, kept to himself, mostly. But there were rumors. What kind of rumors? Eli pressed. Carl took a long drag of his cigarette. People said he had a temper. That he didn't like to be crossed. I never saw much myself, but there was one night. He trailed off, his eyes growing distant. What happened that night? Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Carl hesitated, then shook his head. You don't want to know. Yes, I do, Eli insisted. Please. I need to know. Carl stubbed out his cigarette in an overflowing ashtray. It was after closing. Most of the staff had gone home. Your dad was still there, cleaning up. One of the waitresses, Lisa, I think her name was in the back. They were arguing about something. I didn't stick around to find out what, but the next day, she didn't show up for work. Never saw her again. Eli's stomach turned. Did you tell anyone? Who was I gonna tell? Carl said with a bitter laugh. The cops? They didn't care about us back then. And besides, I didn't see anything happen. Just heard the argument. Eli's mind raced. If Lisa was one of the missing women, this could be the break he needed. But Carl's story raised more questions than answers. What had his father been arguing about? And why did Lisa disappear? As Eli stood to leave, Carl grabbed his arm. You're playing a dangerous game, kid, he said, his voice low. The people behind this, they don't want the truth coming out. Be careful. Eli nodded, his throat tight. He thanked Carl and stepped out into the cool night air. The shadows seemed darker now, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He was closer than ever to uncovering the secrets of the past, but at what cost? Chapter 9. Reckoning. Eli's heart thudded in his chest as he replayed Carl's warning in his mind. The people behind this don't want the truth coming out. Be careful. Those words haunted him as he drove back to his apartment, the night pressing in like a suffocating shroud. The thought of his father's involvement in the disappearances felt less like a mystery and more like a threat, looming over him. Inside his apartment, Eli locked the door and sank into his chair. His corkboard stared back at him, now crowded with faces, dates, and unanswered questions. Lisa's disappearance, Carl's cryptic warnings, and his father's shadowy past all seemed to converge on one undeniable truth. Eli was running out of time to connect the dots before someone stopped him. He picked up his recorder, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Episode 9, he began. Tonight, we delve deeper into the lives of those who vanished, the whispers of violence, and the cover-ups that followed. But most importantly, we focus on the people left behind, the ones who've been silenced for far too long. Eli woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through his window, his phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was Rachel. You need to see this, she said, skipping pleasantries. Check your email. I found something big. Still groggy, Eli opened his laptop. Rachel had sent him a scanned document, a police report dated 1997, filed by Lisa. In it, she accused a coworker of stalking her. The report named a specific individual, James Crawford. Eli's blood ran cold. His father's name stood out like a jagged tear in the fabric of his life. He read the report 3 times, each word driving a spike deeper into his chest. Lisa had written about feeling unsafe, about strange phone calls and shadowy figures outside her window. And then she vanished. It's him, Eli whispered, his voice cracking. It has to be him. Rachel's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. Eli, I'm not saying this proves anything. But it's a lead. We can't ignore it. I know, Eli said, swallowing hard. I don't know how to process this. You don't have to do it alone, Rachel said softly. I'm here, and if we're going to get to the bottom of this, we need to stay focused. This isn't just about your dad. It's about all of them. Later that day, Eli drove back to the diner. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. He parked far from the building, his eyes scanning the area for anything out of place. The diner seemed ordinary at first glance, but Eli knew better. Every corner, every creak of the floorboards held secrets waiting to be uncovered. He walked inside, the familiar scent of grease and coffee enveloping him. A waitress glanced at him with mild curiosity but didn't say anything. Eli took a seat near the back, close to the kitchen. He pulled out his notebook and began jotting down observations. After a few minutes, he spotted her, Marla, the elderly waitress who had worked there for decades. She shuffled between tables, her apron stained and her eyes tired. When she approached his table, Eli smiled. Coffee? She asked. Please, Eli said, and if you have a minute, I'd love to ask you a few questions about the diner's history. Marla's expression hardened slightly. Depends on what you want to know. Eli leaned in, lowering his voice. I'm looking into some of the people who used to work here in the 90s. Do you remember Lisa? Marla's hand froze as she poured the coffee. Her eyes flicked to his for a moment, then back to the cup. I remember, she said cautiously. Why are you asking about her? I think she might be connected to something bigger, Eli said. Anything you can tell me would help. Marla sighed and slid into the booth across from him. Lisa was a sweet girl, but she had a tough time here. Always looking over her shoulder, like someone was after her. I told her to quit, to get out while she could, but she wouldn't listen. Did she ever say who she was afraid of? Eli asked. Marla hesitated. She mentioned a few names. One of them was your dad. Eli's heart sank. What did she say about him? Nothing specific, Marla said. Just that he gave her the creeps. She said he'd stare at her sometimes, like he was watching her every move. But Lisa wasn't the only one who had trouble here. There were others. Eli's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Marla glanced around the diner, then leaned in closer. This place has a history, kid. People come and go, and not all of them leave willingly. You think Lisa's the only one who vanished? Think again. Eli's stomach churned. Do you know who's behind it? Marla shook her head. I don't know, and I don't want to know. All I can tell you is, you're digging in dangerous soil. Be careful who you trust. As Marla stood and walked away, Eli's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was darker than he could have imagined. His father's name kept surfacing, tied to whispers and warnings that painted him as more than just a quiet cook. But Eli couldn't stop now. The truth was within reach, and he would uncover it, no matter the cost. Chapter 10. Revelations. The night was oppressively silent as Eli sat in his apartment, the corkboard in front of him now fully crowded with strings connecting faces, locations, and dates. The threads all converged on one undeniable conclusion. His father had been at the center of the disappearances. But how deep did it go? And why? He needed answers, and there was only one place left to go. Eli's car idled outside the old diner, its neon sign flickering like a heartbeat. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his palms sweating. A voice recording of his latest podcast episode played on a loop in his mind. Tonight, we uncover the truth behind the shadows that haunt this small town. The answers we seek might destroy everything we thought we knew. Gathering his courage, Eli stepped out of the car. The air was heavy, thick with an unshakable tension. As he approached the diner, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Carl. You shouldn't have come back here, Carl said, his voice low. I warned you. I'm not leaving until I get answers, Eli said firmly. Everything points to this place. To my dad. Carl's face was unreadable. Come with me, he said after a moment. If you're set on knowing, I'll show you. Carl led Eli through the diner's kitchen and down a narrow staircase Eli hadn't known existed. The basement smelled of damp earth and mildew, the faint hum of fluorescent lights adding to the unease. At the far end of the room, Carl stopped in front of a large metal cabinet. This is what you've been looking for, Carl said, opening the doors. Inside were stacks of old records, photos, and newspaper clippings. Eli's breath caught as he sifted through them. Photos of Lisa and the other women who had disappeared. A journal, his father's, detailing his shifts at the diner and cryptic notes about cleaning up messes. And then, a single Polaroid of Eli as a child, sitting at the diner counter with Lisa in the background, her smile strained. He was involved, Eli whispered, his voice shaking. But why? Carl hesitated, then said, your dad wasn't acting alone. The diner. It's been part of this town for decades. And for decades, it's been a hunting ground. Eli's stomach churned. Hunting ground? What are you saying? Carl's eyes met Eli's. There are people in this town, powerful people, who made sure those disappearances stayed unsolved. Your dad got caught up in it. He did their dirty work, but he wasn't the mastermind. Who? Eli demanded. Who's behind this? Before Carl could answer, the sound of a car door slamming upstairs made them both freeze. Eli's heart raced as heavy footsteps descended the stairs. A tall man in a dark suit appeared, his expression cold and calculated. Eli Whitaker, the man said, his voice calm but menacing. You've been asking too many questions. Who are you? Eli asked, stepping back. The man ignored the question. This ends tonight. You'll delete everything. the recordings, the episodes, the notes. And you'll forget what you've learned. Eli's hands clenched into fists. I won't stop. People deserve to know the truth. The man's eyes narrowed. You think you're a hero, don't you? This isn't a story, Eli. It's a machine, and you're just a cog. Break the machine, and it will crush you. Suddenly, Carl lunged at the man, grappling him to the ground. Go! Carl shouted. Get out of here. Eli hesitated for a split second, then grabbed the journal and photos and bolted up the stairs. He didn't look back as he ran to his car, the sound of the struggle echoing behind him. He drove away, his heart pounding, the weight of the evidence beside him. Eli uploaded his final podcast episode later that night. It was raw, unpolished, and brimming with the evidence he had uncovered. He named names, shared photos, and exposed the web of corruption that had gripped the town for decades. As the episode went live, Eli sat in his apartment, staring at the corkboard. His father's face stared back at him, not as the man he had loved, but as a stranger caught in the undertow of something far larger. A knock at the door startled him. He approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. Rachel stood outside, holding a thumb drive. You're going to want to see this, she said as he opened the door. Eli took the drive and plugged it into his laptop. The screen filled with more documents, more photos, and a single video file. He clicked on it, and the screen showed his father, sitting at the diner counter, speaking directly into the camera. If you're watching this, Eli, his father said, his voice heavy with regret, then you've uncovered the truth. I'm sorry for everything, but there's more to this story than you know. And now, it's up to you to finish what I couldn't. Eli sat back, his mind reeling. The answers he sought had only opened more questions. But one thing was clear, the fight wasn't over, and he was ready to face whatever came next. Thank you for listening to this story by Niall Davis and Defcon Eagle. We hope that you enjoyed it, and if you did, please like and subscribe to our channel for more stories. If you want to be notified when we release a new one, hit that bell. Have a wonderful day. Until next time.